The grand ballroom of the historic Rosewood Manor was a vision of elegance. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the room, highlighting the rich tapestries and intricate woodwork that adorned the walls. The scent of roses, lilies, and jasmine filled the air, mingling with the tantalizing aromas of gourmet dishes being served to the assembled guests. Laughter and chatter echoed through the hall as friends and family of the bride, Emily, and the groom, Richard, eagerly awaited the ceremony. Emily stood in a private room just off the main hall, surrounded by her bridesmaids. Her lace gown flowed around her like a cloud, the intricate beading shimmering with every movement. Her veil, delicate and sheer, was pinned in place by a diamond-studded tiara that had been a gift from her grandmother. As she gazed at her reflection in the ornate mirror, a mixture of nerves and excitement bubbled within her. "You're the most beautiful bride I've ever seen," Sarah, her maid of honor, whispered, giving Emily's hand a reassuring squeeze. The other bridesmaids nodded in agreement, their smiles warm and encouraging. Outside, the orchestra began to play the processional music, signaling the start of the ceremony. Guests turned their attention to the grand staircase, which descended into the ballroom. One by one, the bridesmaids made their way down the stairs, their dresses a soft blush that complemented the overall color scheme. The flower girl followed, scattering rose petals along the aisle with a shy smile. Finally, it was Emily's turn. Taking a deep breath, she stepped onto the staircase, her heart pounding with each step. The guests rose to their feet, all eyes on her as she descended. The orchestra's music swelled, adding to the sense of anticipation and joy that filled the room. But as Emily reached the halfway point of the staircase, a collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Beside her, just barely visible in the shimmering light, was another figure. A bride, translucent and ethereal, wearing a gown from a bygone era. The ghostly bride's dress was an exquisite antique, its lace and satin design harking back to the early 20th century. Her face, though beautiful, was marked by an expression of deep sorrow and longing. Her eyes, hollow and haunting, were fixed intently on Richard, who stood at the altar with a look of bewildered horror. The apparition's presence was undeniable, yet impossible to comprehend. Some guests rubbed their eyes, believing it to be a trick of the light or a manifestation of their imaginations. Others whispered hurried prayers, sensing something far more sinister at play. The room, which had moments before been filled with joy and excitement, was now thick with tension and unease. Emily, unaware of the ghostly figure beside her, continued her descent, her smile faltering slightly as she noticed the change in the room's atmosphere. She reached the altar and took Richard's hand, looking up at him with love and trust. But Richard's face was ashen, his eyes darting nervously toward the ghostly bride who now stood just a few feet away, her hand outstretched as if in a silent plea. The officiant cleared his throat, attempting to regain the ceremony's momentum. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Emily and Richard." His voice wavered as he, too, caught sight of the spectral figure. He stumbled over his words, casting furtive glances at the apparition that seemed to hover just at the edge of his vision. As the ceremony proceeded, the ghostly bride vanished as mysteriously as she had appeared, leaving behind a palpable sense of dread. The guests, though outwardly composed, exchanged anxious glances, their minds racing with questions and fears. Whispers of the ghostly figure spread like wildfire through the crowd, but the ceremony pressed on, each word and gesture overshadowed by the unspoken horror that had touched their perfect day. Richard's grip on Emily's hand tightened, his knuckles white with tension. Emily glanced up at him, her brow furrowing with concern. She opened her mouth to ask if he was all right, but before she could speak, the officiant called for the exchange of vows. Pushing aside her unease, Emily focused on the man she loved, hoping that whatever had just happened was a fleeting anomaly. But as she looked into Richard's eyes, she couldn't shake the feeling that the ghostly bride's appearance was a harbinger of something far darker and more sinister than any of them could imagine. The ceremony concluded with the traditional exchange of rings and vows, though the air remained thick with unease. Emily and Richard were pronounced husband and wife, and the guests' applause was polite but subdued. The unsettling vision of the ghostly bride lingered in everyone's minds, casting a shadow over the joyous occasion. As the newlyweds made their way to the reception hall, the guests followed, their conversations now dominated by speculation and hushed whispers about the apparition. The grand reception room was equally as splendid as the ballroom, adorned with twinkling fairy lights and towering floral arrangements. The atmosphere, however, was markedly tense. Emily and Richard took their places at the head table, smiling and greeting guests as they arrived to offer their congratulations. Despite the outward festivities, Emily couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every so often she caught Richard glancing nervously around the room, his earlier confidence replaced by a palpable anxiety. The dinner commenced with a series of toasts and speeches. Just as Sarah, the maid of honor, was about to deliver her speech, a sudden chill swept through the room. The lights flickered, and a soft, eerie glow illuminated a far corner of the hall. There, once again, stood the ghostly bride. Emily froze, her eyes wide with terror. The apparition, more distinct now, floated closer, her expression one of urgency and sorrow. She pointed directly at Richard, her lips moving silently as if trying to convey a message. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she strained to make out the words, but no sound came forth. Several guests gasped, some even shrieked, and a few bolted for the doors. The band stopped playing, and an eerie silence enveloped the room. Sarah, clutching the microphone, stared in disbelief at the ghostly figure. "Do you see her too?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the tense silence. Emily nodded slowly, her eyes locked on the apparition. She could feel a cold sweat forming on her brow. Richard, on the other hand, seemed to shrink under the ghost's gaze, his face drained of color. "Richard, what is happening?" Emily whispered urgently, but he remained silent, his eyes fixed on the floor. Unable to endure the tension any longer, Emily stood and approached the ghostly bride. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice trembling. The ghost's eyes shifted from Richard to Emily, and for a brief moment a look of profound sadness crossed her ethereal features. She mouthed a single word: "Beware." Before Emily could react, the apparition vanished once again, leaving behind a palpable sense of dread. The guests, still in shock, began to murmur amongst themselves, their fear and confusion growing with each passing moment. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Emily turned to Sarah and a few close friends who had witnessed the ghostly figure. "We need to find out who she is and why she's appearing at our wedding," Emily said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. The small group discreetly began to question the other guests, hoping to piece together any information about the ghostly bride. They learned that the apparition resembled a woman named Clara, who had been engaged to Richard several years ago. Clara had died under mysterious circumstances shortly before their wedding, and rumors about her death had circulated for years. Emily felt a chill run down her spine as she listened to the stories. Clara had been a beautiful and kind-hearted woman, deeply in love with Richard. Her sudden death had been a shock to everyone who knew her. Some said she had died in a tragic accident, while others whispered about foul play. As the investigation continued, Emily found herself drawn to a secluded part of the manor where old photographs and memorabilia were displayed. There, she discovered a picture of Clara and Richard taken shortly before Clara's death. Clara looked radiant in the photo, her eyes sparkling with happiness. Richard, too, looked deeply in love, but there was something in his eyes, a shadow of fear or guilt that Emily had never noticed before. "Emily, look at this," Sarah said, pointing to an old newspaper clipping tucked behind the photograph. The headline read, "Local woman dies in tragic accident days before wedding." The article described how Clara had fallen from a cliff during a hike, but there were no witnesses to confirm the details. As Emily read the article, a sense of foreboding settled over her. The ghostly bride's warnings, Richard's nervous behavior, and the mysterious circumstances of Clara's death all pointed to a darker truth. Determined to uncover what really happened, Emily resolved to confront Richard and demand answers. That night, as the guests slowly departed and the manor grew quiet, Emily found Richard standing alone on the balcony, staring out into the night. She approached him, her heart heavy with fear and resolve. "Richard," she said softly, "we need to talk about Clara." Richard stiffened, his face turning ashen. "What about her?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know she's the ghost we've been seeing. I know there's more to her death than what you've told me. Please, Richard, I need to know the truth," Emily pleaded, her eyes searching his for any sign of honesty. Richard took a deep breath, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "You're right," he said, his voice breaking. "There's so much you don't know, Emily. So much I've tried to forget." Richard's confession began with a deep, shuddering breath, as if he were exhaling years of pent-up guilt and fear. Emily, steeling herself for whatever she was about to hear, clasped her hands tightly, her knuckles white with tension. "It was 3 years ago," Richard began, his voice trembling. "Clara and I were deeply in love, just like you and I are now. Or at least, I thought we were. But she discovered something about me, something I tried to keep hidden. Clara found out about my business dealings." Emily's heart raced as Richard continued, his words coming out in a desperate rush. "I was involved in some illegal activities, things I'm not proud of. Clara, being the person she was, couldn't stand it. She threatened to expose me, to go to the authorities." Emily listened in horror, her mind racing with questions. "What kind of illegal activities?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Embezzlement, fraud," Richard admitted, his eyes haunted. I was young and reckless, trying to make a name for myself. When Clara found out, she was devastated. She couldn't bear the thought of being with someone so corrupt. We had a huge fight, and she left, saying she was going to the police the next day. Emily's breath caught in her throat. So you... What did you do, Richard? Richard's face contorted with anguish. I panicked. I couldn't let her ruin everything I had worked for. I went after her, hoping to talk her out of it. We met at the cliffs, her favorite spot. It was supposed to be a place of peace for her, but that night it became something else. His voice broke and he paused, his eyes glazing over with the memory. We argued again, and in a moment of rage I grabbed her arm. She tried to pull away, and she slipped. I swear, Emily, I didn't mean for her to fall. It was an accident. Emily's world spun. The man she loved had caused Clara's death, however unintentionally. She struggled to reconcile the Richard she knew with the one standing before her, a man who had lied and hidden a dark past. And then what? Emily asked, her voice hollow. What did you do after she fell? I ran, Richard confessed, tears streaming down his face. I was scared and didn't know what to do. I told the police it was an accident and they believed me. No one questioned it too deeply. Clara's family was devastated, but they accepted it. I thought I could move on, start over. Emily stared at him, a mixture of anger and sorrow flooding her. But you didn't tell anyone the truth. You let everyone believe it was just a tragic accident. Richard nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. I was too afraid. And then I met you, and I thought I could leave it all behind. But Clara, her spirit hasn't let me forget. She's been haunting me ever since, reminding me of what I did. Emily took a step back, feeling as though the ground had been pulled out from under her. The ghostly bride's appearances, the warnings, they all made sense now. Clara's spirit had returned to reveal the truth and prevent another woman from being ensnared by Richard's web of lies. Why didn't you tell me this before we got married? Emily asked, her voice shaking with emotion. I thought I could keep it buried, Richard said, his voice barely audible. I didn't want to lose you, Emily. You mean everything to me. But now, I see that I was wrong. Before Emily could respond, a cold breeze swept through the room, and the ghostly bride appeared once more. Her form was clearer than ever, her eyes filled with sorrow and a plea for justice. She pointed again at Richard, her expression a mix of anger and despair. Emily turned to the ghostly figure, her heart aching. Clara, she whispered, I'm so sorry for what happened to you. I promise we'll make this right. You deserve peace. Clara's spectral form seemed to soften at Emily's words. She nodded slowly, her gaze lingering on Richard one last time before fading into the ether. The room grew silent, the chill dissipating as her presence vanished. Richard collapsed to his knees, sobbing uncontrollably. Emily stood over him, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. The man she loved had caused the death of another woman, a woman whose spirit had been trapped in torment because of his actions. She knew she couldn't simply walk away from this revelation. Taking a deep breath, Emily reached out to Richard, lifting him to his feet. We have to tell the truth, she said firmly. We have to set things right, for Clara's sake and for our own. Richard nodded, his face a mask of anguish and regret. I'll do whatever it takes, he whispered, to make amends. Together they left the balcony and rejoined the remaining guests, who had gathered in anxious clusters, still reeling from the night's events. Emily stood before them, her voice strong and unwavering, as she recounted the truth about Clara's death. Richard, by her side, added his own confession, his voice filled with remorse. The guests listened in stunned silence, the weight of the revelations settling over them like a dark cloud. As the truth finally came to light, a sense of solemn resolution filled the room. Clara's spirit had been avenged, and Emily and Richard's future now lay in the hands of justice. As the authorities arrived and took Richard into custody, Emily watched with a heavy heart. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but she also knew that facing the truth was the only way to truly honor Clara's memory and find a path to healing. The aftermath of the night's revelations left the once celebratory atmosphere of the wedding shattered. The grand reception hall, now emptied of most guests, felt like a mausoleum. Emily stood alone near the entrance, the weight of recent events pressing down on her shoulders. Richard had been taken into custody, and the remaining guests murmured among themselves, processing the shocking truth they had just heard. The following days were a blur for Emily. The media caught wind of the story, and Rosewood Manor became the center of a scandal that rocked their social circles. Emily found herself at the heart of the storm, grappling with the betrayal and heartbreak of discovering her husband's dark past. The ghostly figure of Clara haunted her thoughts, a constant reminder of the tragedy that had been concealed for so long. Determined to bring closure to Clara's memory and seek justice, Emily decided to delve deeper into the circumstances surrounding Clara's death. She began by visiting Clara's family, who had long since moved away from the area. When she arrived at their modest home, she was met with suspicion and grief. Clara's mother, a frail woman with eyes that bore the weight of years of sorrow, greeted her at the door. "Why have you come?" Clara's mother asked, her voice laced with pain. "Haven't we suffered enough?" Emily took a deep breath, her resolve unwavering. "I came to tell you the truth about Clara's death. I know what really happened, and I want to make things right." Over cups of tea in the dimly lit living room, Emily recounted everything that had transpired at the wedding. Clara's mother listened in stunned silence, tears streaming down her cheeks as Emily revealed Richard's confession. When she finished, Clara's mother took a trembling hand and placed it over Emily's. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion, "for bringing the truth to light. Clara was such a bright and loving soul. She didn't deserve what happened to her." With the support of Clara's family, Emily approached the authorities with the new evidence. The investigation into Clara's death was reopened, and Richard faced charges of involuntary manslaughter and obstruction of justice. The legal proceedings were long and arduous, but Emily attended every hearing, her presence a silent testament to her commitment to justice for Clara. Throughout the trial, Emily found herself haunted by Clara's ghostly visage. She often woke in the middle of the night, her dreams filled with the ethereal figure of the ghostly bride. Clara's presence, however, no longer felt threatening. Instead, it seemed to carry a sense of gratitude and relief, as if the spirit were finally finding peace. One night, as Emily lay in bed, she felt a sudden chill in the room. She opened her eyes to see Clara standing at the foot of her bed, her translucent form glowing softly in the moonlight. This time, there was no sorrow or anger in her expression, only a serene calm. "Thank you," Clara's voice echoed in the quiet room, clear and melodious. "You have set me free." Tears welled in Emily's eyes as she sat up, reaching out toward the apparition. "I'm so sorry for what happened to you," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "I wish I could have done more." Clara shook her head, her form beginning to fade. "You did everything I needed. You brought the truth to light and gave me peace. Now it's time for you to find your own." As Clara's spirit vanished, the room grew warm again, and Emily felt a profound sense of closure. She lay back down, a weight lifted from her heart, and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. In the weeks that followed, Emily annulled her marriage to Richard and began the difficult process of rebuilding her life. She sought solace in her friendships and family, who supported her through the challenging times. The scandal that had surrounded her began to fade, and she found herself embracing a new sense of purpose. Emily became involved in advocacy work, supporting victims of domestic abuse and fighting for justice for those who had been wronged. Clara's story inspired her to help others and ensure that their voices were heard. Through her efforts, she found healing and strength, turning her pain into a force for good. Years later, as Emily walked through the gardens of Rosewood Manor, now a public memorial for victims of injustice, she felt a sense of peace. The ghostly bride was no longer a haunting presence in her life, but a guiding spirit that had led her to her true calling. Emily knew that Clara's memory would live on, not as a tragic figure, but as a beacon of hope and justice for all who had been silenced. And as the sun set over the horizon, casting a golden glow over the manor, Emily felt Clara's presence one last time, a gentle, reassuring warmth that whispered of forgiveness and eternal peace.